In the general population, ADHD is just present in about 5% of individuals. But for people with borderline personality disorder, this rate is nearly 30 to 60%. And this is just for people with BPD who are formally diagnosed with ADHD. About 60% of patients with BPD had signs of childhood ADHD as well. So why is this connection so prevalent? In order to understand this, let's understand how borderline personality disorder is formed first. The most common theory for why borderline personality disorder is formed in individuals is the BioPsychoSocial theory. I'm going to leave some links in the description down below if you want to read further on this. This theory was developed by Marsha Linehan, who is a pioneer in borderline personality disorder research, and it essentially states that there are two main factors that kind of go into why someone has borderline personality disorder. One is their genetics. This is part of the equation. Individuals with borderline personality disorder tend to have much more intense emotions. They go from 0 to 100 really quickly, and they get there much faster off of much smaller triggers. And their emotions tend to have a much harder time coming back down to normal when compared to other people. But this alone isn't enough for someone to develop borderline personality disorder, as there are many people with these genetic traits that actually end up without the disorder later in life. The second piece that we typically need in order to see borderline personality disorder develop is an invalidating childhood environment. What this means is this is an environment in which you're told that your feelings are not necessarily real. What this might look like is people calling you oversensitive, people saying that you're exaggerating when you talk about your feelings, so on and so forth. The reason that these two things lead to borderline personality disorder forming is that there are kind of one of two reactions that you can have in this kind of environment with these genetics. One, you can either learn that escalating reactions get your emotional needs to be met. What this means is that if you're a child with the genetics that make you susceptible to borderline personality disorder, and you're in an environment where your emotional needs won't be met because your emotional needs are seen as not valid, what you will do is you will blow things out of proportion in order to get your emotional needs met. Because your caregivers or whoever's around you when you're growing up, you might realize that if you have an exceedingly intense emotional reaction, if you throw a tantrum, if you cry really loud, if you yell more and more and more, eventually there's a certain threshold at which your emotional needs will be met. That's one way that this response is kind of developed. Another way that children will sometimes react is that they will just completely suppress and hide their emotions as much as possible. They learn that in that invalidating environment, there's no hope for them to ever get their emotional needs met, so they just suppress everything and numb it as much as they can. Both of these approaches lead to kind of some of the symptoms we see with borderline: the intense emotions, the mood swings, the using of substances and unhealthy vices in order to numb and suppress feelings, so on and so forth. So what does this have to do with ADHD? Let's understand the connection a little bit better. With ADHD, we immediately start to see some of the connections to borderline personality disorder. For one, the symptoms overlap quite a bit. The impulsivity is one of the most obvious connections we can make, but beyond that, emotional dysregulation is also extremely common between borderline and ADHD. Phenomena like rejection sensitivity are also very common between the two. Being bored or feeling empty is also a common experience, so on and so forth. The reason these experiences are so common to each other is because the childhoods of those with borderline personality and ADHD are very similar, and these disorders kind of complement each other in such a way that it's very obvious why they both tend to develop simultaneously. For one, the kind of genetic predisposition of being more sensitive and stuff like that is very prevalent in ADHD, as people with ADHD tend to be more sensitive and more easily overstimulated than individuals without ADHD. Again, tying in that kind of emotional dysregulation piece, they also tend to have much more intense emotions, similar to those with BPD. And not only that, but individuals with ADHD very frequently have an invalidating childhood environment. They're seen as people who exaggerate, who lie, who are lazy, and who don't really care about anyone but themselves. Many ADHD symptoms, kind of appear to other people without ADHD as just being lazy, being careless, so on and so forth. Lots of ADHD kids face constant invalidation, so we can immediately see the clear-cut connection between the two. What likely drives this connection between ADHD and BPD is that ADHD kind of sets you up with the genetic predisposition to have higher emotional sensitivity, as well as having an invalidating environment growing up, and thus the kind of root cause ADHD develops into BPD later on in life. As you learn to either have extremely intense emotional reactions in order to get your needs met, or you learn to numb and suppress everything as much as possible. So why is this useful to know? Let's talk about how getting this insight actually helped me quite a bit in relieving both my borderline and ADHD symptoms. Once I understood this connection between borderline personality disorder and ADHD, what I started to realize is a lot of the things that I thought were borderline symptoms were actually way more akin to ADHD symptoms. The first thing I realized was this kind of feeling of being empty. This is a common symptom for people with borderline personality disorder. A song by Juice WRLD actually describes it really well, and it's called Empty. It's this feeling of constant dissatisfaction, boredom, loneliness, etc., etc. And this oftentimes only really goes away, at least for me and for other people with borderline personality disorder, when you either fall in love with someone, you have something new new and exciting in your life, and as soon as the kind of novelty of something wears off, you tend to again feel empty and numb once again. And for a long time, I didn't know how to get rid of this until I realized this isn't really a BPD symptom, this is more of an ADHD symptom. The ADHD brain tends to be very understimulated, and this is what causes that feeling of constantly being bored. This also affects our relationships as well. Because of this ability to get easily bored, relationships tend to be very short. People with ADHD will oftentimes, go headfirst into hobbies, get super into something, hyper focus on it, and then never think about it again. This is very common in what happens with BPD relationships. They get into relationships very quickly, the novelty, the excitement of it gets them very excited, they get super passionate and super into it, and then after a little bit, they realize that they didn't really like the person, they just like the novelty. Another big symptom that's a huge overlap between borderline and ADHD is the impulsivity. Reckless behaviors oftentimes happen in BPD because they're trying to numb intense, overwhelming feelings. They also come as a result of us trying to numb the boredom or emptiness we feel. And this has huge parallels with ADHD. When people are growing up with ADHD or borderline, they need very different coping skills when they compare themselves to their other peers who don't have these conditions, and they oftentimes don't learn any of these coping skills and are expected to perform at the same level as their peers. So in order to do so, they have to kind of experiment and find stuff that works, and oftentimes what works really well, unfortunately, is maladaptive coping mechanisms. Things like substance use, binge eating, so on and so forth, very quickly lead to having your emotions regulated really well and also curing yourself of that boredom or emptiness. For both people with borderline and people with ADHD, both of these conditions lead you to have very intense emotional dysregulation, where you have very intense highs and lows. These highs and lows need to be taken care of. And again, for people with these conditions who aren't taught the proper skills that they need to manage their conditions, they will turn to things like substance use or binge eating in order to numb these intense emotions so they can live the life they want to. Curing this boredom or emptiness feeling is also important as well, as this is what typically drives us to these impulsive decisions that will kind of have huge negative ramifications across our lives. It's hard to work at, a consistent job, to stay in a relationship, so on and so forth, if every few months you start to feel very empty and need something new. There's also other subtle ways that these two disorders really overlap, and we can definitely see them in the fear of abandonment and rejection sensitivity fears that overlap between both. For people with borderline, a lot of people will say that they're way too intense for them to handle. And the same thing is said about people with ADHD. Both of these conditions kind of predispose you to not be able to have casual friendships. You need to have friends who are very intense, all or nothing, ride or die, so on and so forth. And you tend to jump into these things very quickly, which is too much for people who don't have these same conditions. So because of that, oftentimes as a kid, people with borderline or with ADHD struggle to have long-term consistent friendships. Either the emotional dysregulation they have, the difficulty with impulsivity and controlling their anger outbursts across both conditions, lead them to losing friends, or having a difficulty making them in the first place. Especially with ADHD, when you can be forgetful, you can have a hard time making it on time to places, stuff like that. And this can lead people to not want to be your friend because they perceive you as careless rather than having a mental disorder, for which you don't have the tools to deal with. So again, you can see both of these conditions will predispose you to having a rejection sensitivity or fear of abandonment mindset, because it's harder to make friends and to have close connections with both of these conditions due to the things that they predispose you to do. This also explains why people with BPD and ADHD will tend to attract each other. They can understand each other's lives so well typically because they've had very similar experiences growing up. So now that you know all of this, what are the next steps that you can do? I'm going to link a couple of videos up here and up here, somewhere on the screen, that go over my top tips to deal with borderline personality disorder and ADHD. I've suffered from both of these disorders and I've made a full recovery and live a happy, healthy life. I hope these next videos help you out. Thank you for watching and take care.